The spoon wasn't heavy, that was the irritating part. A polished silver soup spoon from the Oak Ridge Heritage Club shouldn't have felt like a piece of gym equipment, but my left hand disagreed. The handle rested between my fingers, while a faint tremor worked its way through my wrist. The movement was small enough that most people wouldn't notice it. Unfortunately, my family had spent years training themselves to notice every flaw. The spoon tapped softly against the edge of the bowl, then again, then once more. I lowered it before anyone else could comment. The white tablecloth stretched across the length of the dining table without a wrinkle in sight. Every glass reflected the chandelier above. Every fork sat at a mathematically precise angle. Somebody at this club probably had a ruler hidden in their pocket. My mother certainly appreciated the effort. "Sit up a little straighter," Cynthia whispered without looking at me. I adjusted my posture. Not because I agreed, because I was tired. The silk blouse clung to my arms in a way that made me feel like I was wearing somebody else's skin. It was cream-colored, expensive, and completely impractical. My mother had purchased it 3 days earlier from a boutique that didn't bother displaying prices. "It softens everything," she'd said. What she meant was that it covered the scars. The burn grafts stretched from my left wrist nearly to my elbow. Most days, I didn't think much about them. They were simply part of my body now, like freckles or fingerprints. My family treated them like graffiti. Beside me, Sutton adjusted the position of her wine glass by half an inch. Then she checked her reflection in it, then she adjusted it again. My younger sister had somehow turned sitting at a dinner table into a competitive sport. Her dark dress looked tailored directly onto her body. Her nails were flawless. Her posture belonged in a magazine advertisement for expensive furniture. I once watched Sutton return a salad because one walnut was broken. That should tell you everything. At the head of the table, my father checked his gold watch for the 3rd time in 6 minutes. Howard Gallagher never appeared nervous. Tonight he was close. He glanced toward the entrance of the dining room, then toward the private event coordinator standing near the fireplace. A folded leather portfolio rested beside his plate. He had spent the entire drive rehearsing conversational topics that sounded spontaneous while being neither spontaneous nor conversational. The man could prepare for a handshake like it was a military operation. Ironically, I was the one who had actually been in the military. My thumb shifted against the spoon again. A small tremor traveled through my hand, the same hand that had once gripped a rescue harness while smoke rolled across the surface of the ocean. The same hand that stopped obeying perfectly after a helicopter fuselage turned into an inferno off the coast of Somalia. The surgeons had done incredible work. Nerves, unfortunately, don't always read instruction manuals. My father leaned slightly toward me. "Maeve," he said quietly. I already knew the tone. "Keep that hand in your lap until the food arrives." I stared at him. He continued. "You're making the tablecloth shake." 3 seconds passed. 4, 5. I placed my left hand beneath the table, not because he was right, because arguing would only turn a private insult into a public performance. Howard returned his attention to the room as if he'd just solved an administrative issue. Problem handled, image protected, mission accomplished. The strange thing was that I'd spent years jumping out of helicopters into rough water without feeling insulted. You learn very quickly that the ocean doesn't care about your feelings. But family? Family knows exactly where to aim. A waiter stopped beside our table and refilled water glasses. My father thanked him with the polished confidence of a man who believed generosity could be measured through proper eye contact. The second the waiter walked away, Sutton leaned closer. "You could have worn the navy dress." I didn't look at her. "It still has short sleeves." She sighed dramatically. "Exactly." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. For years, my family had treated my injuries like an awkward topic at Thanksgiving. Something to hide from guests. Something to explain away if necessary. Something unfortunate that happened to an otherwise presentable daughter. The funny part was that strangers usually handled it better. Truck drivers, dock workers, veterans, single moms at grocery stores, random people I'd meet while waiting for coffee. Most of them saw the scars and moved on with their lives. My family turned them into a monthly committee meeting. Across the room, a server polished a row of wine glasses while a pianist played quietly near the bar. The club smelled faintly of cedar wood, expensive cologne, and money that had been inherited long enough to become boring. I looked around and wondered how many people here had ever held onto something heavier than a stock portfolio. Then I immediately regretted the thought. Bitterness is easy. Discipline is harder. The tremor returned. I curled my fingers beneath the table and waited for it to pass. Sometimes it lasted 2 seconds. Sometimes 20. Nobody could predict it. Least of all me. A notification flashed briefly on my father's phone. He checked it, smiled, and slipped it back into his pocket. Whatever message he received seemed to ease his anxiety. For the moment. Because his eyes drifted right back toward the entrance. Waiting, calculating, preparing. As though the entire evening depended on one man's arrival. Maybe it did. I watched my father smooth the front of his jacket and suddenly realized something. The scars embarrassed him less than the reminder of how they got there. Because scars ask uncomfortable questions. What happened? Who paid the price? Who stepped forward when everyone else stepped back? Those answers never fit neatly into a luxury dining room. Before the first course even arrived, I already knew exactly what role I was expected to play tonight. Not daughter, not guest, not former service member, decoration. A patriotic accessory with sleeves long enough to stay out of the photographs. And right before the dining room doors opened again, bringing a ripple of attention across the club, I finally looked down at the hand hidden beneath the table. It was still shaking. Have you ever accomplished something difficult in life, only to have the people closest to you focus on the one thing they considered imperfect? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, resilience, and the moments that reveal who people really are, remember our new stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine, and I'll see you at the next story. I slid my hand back onto my lap and watched my father check the entrance again. That was when it finally became obvious why I was sitting at this table. Not because anyone missed me. Not because this was some rare family gathering. Not because my father had suddenly decided a daughter was more important than a business opportunity. I was inventory. Useful inventory. Howard Gallagher owned Gallagher Coastal Freight, a shipping company that stretched from Maine to Texas. The company moved everything from industrial machinery to refrigerated medical supplies. 3 years earlier, he had acquired 2 struggling port operators for $47.6 million and spent every family dinner talking about strategic expansion. Most people call it buying companies. My father called it vision. Tonight, that vision needed approval. The Federal Port Committee was preparing to award a logistics contract worth more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Whoever won it would control cargo movement through several federally managed facilities along the East Coast. Howard wanted that contract badly. The kind of badly that kept him awake. The kind of badly that made him suddenly remember he had 2 daughters. I wasn't invited because I was family. I was invited because I was marketing material. A former Navy search and rescue swimmer seated conveniently beside a shipping executive who happened to love America. At least for one evening. The waiter appeared with bread service. Sutton immediately declined the butter, not because she disliked butter, because she disliked calories being visible. The waiter set a basket in front of me. I took a roll. Sutton glanced down, then at me, then at the bread. The woman could communicate disappointment without moving a single facial muscle. It was honestly impressive. "You know they're serving 4 courses, right?" she asked. I tore off a piece of bread. "That's usually how dinner works," she sighed. My father ignored us. His attention remained fixed on the entrance. I looked around the dining room. The Oak Ridge Heritage Club specialized in a very specific type of wealth. Not flashy wealth, not celebrity wealth. This was the quieter version. The kind that wore navy blazers and talked about tax strategies during golf. Every table seemed occupied by people who looked professionally comfortable. The room practically had a dress code for facial expressions. Across from me, my mother adjusted the cuff of her jacket. "Just enjoy the evening," she said softly. I almost smiled. My mother had spent 30 years translating surrender into advice. When my father criticized somebody, she called it concern. When he controlled people, she called it guidance. When he humiliated someone, she called it stress. Cynthia wasn't cruel. She was exhausted. There is a difference. One causes damage. The other allows it. The waiter returned to refill water glasses. My father finally looked away from the entrance long enough to speak. "Admiral Cole should be here shortly." Nobody responded. He continued anyway. "I've heard he's very practical. Translation. Useful. I've heard he values leadership. Translation, influence. And service. Translation, military credentials. His eyes landed on me just for a second. Then he smiled. The smile looked expensive, which was it's nice to have family here. There it was, the sales pitch. I wondered whether he practiced that line in the mirror. Sutton picked up her wine glass and examined her reflection in it. "You know what would help tonight?" she said. I already knew I wasn't going to enjoy the answer. "What?" "Just let Dad do the talking." I laughed before I could stop myself. Not loudly. Just enough. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm serious." "I know. Then don't make it harder." "Harder for who?" She ignored the question. That usually meant the answer was embarrassing. Sutton leaned slightly closer. "And if they serve steak, maybe ask the waiter to cut it in the kitchen first." I stared at her. She continued. "We don't need a struggle tonight." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I remembered Sutton rarely joked unless somebody else was the punchline. My left hand twitched once beneath the table. The timing felt almost comedic. I looked at my sister. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfect manicure. A woman who once cried because a gallery brochure used the wrong shade of ivory. Meanwhile, she was giving advice to someone who had pulled unconscious people out of the ocean. Life has a sense of humor, a weird one. I reached for my water glass with my right hand. "Anything else?" Sutton considered it. "Just try not to draw attention." There it was, the real issue. Not my hand. Not my injury. Attention. Because attention created questions. Questions led to explanations. Explanations led to scars. Scars ruined the presentation. I suddenly understood something that should have been obvious years ago. My family didn't dislike my injuries. They disliked what my injuries interrupted. The image, the symmetry. The carefully staged photograph they carried around in their heads. As a successful businessman, a graceful wife, a beautiful younger daughter, and somewhere in the back corner, preferably out of frame, the damaged veteran. Useful when patriotic credentials were needed, invisible the rest of the time. Like a chipped vase brought out only when guests enjoyed antique stories. The realization didn't hurt, not anymore. That was the strange part. At some point, disappointment becomes predictable. Predictable things lose their power. I watched my father straighten his tie again. The same tie he had adjusted 6 times since we arrived. The same tie he wore during investor meetings. The same tie he wore when he wanted something. Howard Gallagher believed every problem could be solved through presentation. Better suit, better smile, better table, better story. What he never understood was that serious people eventually stop listening to stories. They start looking for character. The room shifted slightly as several heads turned toward the entrance. A club employee appeared near the front doors. Another followed. Conversation softened. Even my father sat a little straighter. Interesting. For the first time all evening, he looked less like the most important person in the room and more like someone waiting for permission. His fingers adjusted his cufflinks. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the doors opened, and the man my father had spent months trying to impress finally walked into the room. My father's fingers stopped moving the second the man stepped through the doorway. That alone told me everything. Howard Gallagher rarely stopped doing anything. The conversations around the dining room softened without anyone being asked. A few people glanced up from their meals. A server carrying a tray instinctively stepped aside to clear the path. Nobody made a scene. People with real authority rarely require one. Admiral Cole walked beside the club manager with the relaxed pace of someone who had spent a lifetime entering rooms where everyone already knew his name. He was taller than I expected. Broad shoulders, silver hair, dark suit, no unnecessary accessories, no oversized watch, no flashy cufflinks. Nothing that looked purchased for the purpose of impressing strangers. His attention moved through the room once, then again. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That was all it took. By the time he reached our table, I had the distinct feeling he'd already formed opinions about half the people in the building. My father stood so quickly his chair nearly scraped the floor. Admiral Cole, there it was, the voice, the special business voice, slightly louder, slightly warmer, carefully manufactured enthusiasm. Howard extended his hand, the Admiral accepted it. My father immediately launched into what was clearly a rehearsed welcome speech. "We're deeply honored you could join us this evening. The Gallagher family has always admired your service. In fact, I've followed your work with the Federal Port Committee for years." I tuned out after that, not because it was boring, because I'd heard versions of the same performance my entire life. When Howard wanted investors, he became an investor. When he wanted politicians, he became political. When he wanted veterans, he became patriotic. The man could adapt faster than a software update. Admiral Cole listened politely. That was the interesting part. He listened, but he didn't participate. There was a difference. Several times my father offered openings for conversation. Several times the Admiral answered with short professional responses. Nothing rude, nothing encouraging. A chess player refusing bad moves. Eventually everyone sat down. The Admiral unfolded his napkin and placed it neatly on his lap. No rush, no performance. Just a man sitting down for dinner. My father immediately began talking again. Naturally, my mother smiled politely. Sutton smiled strategically. The Admiral nodded to each of them. Mrs. Gallagher, Cynthia, pleasure to meet you. Then he turned toward Sutton. I've heard you're involved in art brokerage. Sutton practically lit up. Finally, a subject she enjoyed. Oh yes, contemporary acquisitions, mostly. For the next minute, she discussed galleries, private collections, and market valuations. To her credit, she actually sounded knowledgeable. The Admiral listened respectfully, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers. Then his eyes shifted. Toward me, not my blouse, not my hair, not the sleeve hiding most of my arm. Me, Howard reacted instantly. Like a salesman noticing a customer drifting toward the wrong product. And this is my eldest daughter, Maeve. There was a slight pause, just enough for him to decide which version of me he wanted to present. Spent some time in the Navy. Sometime. I almost smiled. 8 years apparently qualified as sometime. We're very proud of her. Another pause. Though we're certainly glad she's home now, trying to settle into a normal life. There it was, the family-approved biography. Short, safe, neatly packaged. No mention of injuries, no mention of rescue operations, no mention of why my left hand occasionally ignored instructions, just enough military service to sound impressive. Not enough to make anybody uncomfortable. The Admiral never looked away from me, not once, and he definitely didn't look at my father. That surprised me. Most people instinctively followed the loudest voice at the table. Cole didn't seem interested in the loudest voice. He seemed interested in the most honest one. He offered a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing ceremonial, just quiet respect, professional recognition. One veteran acknowledging another. I returned the nod. No words necessary. Something shifted in my father's expression. Tiny, almost invisible. But I caught it. Because Howard had expected the interaction to pass through him. Instead, it had gone around him completely. The waiter arrived with the first course, roasted tomato bisque. The kind of soup expensive restaurants serve in bowls large enough to park a car and shallow enough to hold 6 spoonfuls. My father resumed steering the conversation, shipping lanes, port expansion, labor efficiency, projected growth. The Admiral answered when appropriate, asked questions when necessary. The problem for my father was that every answer seemed to generate more questions. And those questions weren't always comfortable. How are you handling dock retention? Cole asked. My father answered. Then another question followed. Turnover rates? Another answer. Safety audits. Another answer. The conversation sounded friendly. It wasn't, not entirely. I recognized the pattern. The Admiral wasn't making small talk. He was gathering data. A lot of people mistake politeness for agreement. That's an expensive mistake. My father kept smiling, but I noticed him touching his watch again. Then his cufflink, then the edge of his napkin. Little signs. Tiny leaks in the armor. Meanwhile, I concentrated on the soup, holding the spoon carefully, keeping my left hand mostly still. The tremor had behaved so far. That didn't mean anything. Nerve damage doesn't respect schedules. A faint twitch moved through my wrist, then disappeared. I set the spoon down, waited, picked it up again. Across the table, my mother noticed. Of course she noticed. Mothers always do, even the quiet ones. For a brief second, I saw concern in her eyes. Real concern. Not embarrassment, not management, just concern. Then it vanished behind years of habit. The conversation continued. The dining room remained calm. Silverware clinked softly against china. Glasses touched tabletops. Waiters moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Everything looked perfectly controlled. But I knew better. My father's entire strategy depended on maintaining an illusion. One wrong moment. One visible crack. One reminder that real people are messier than marketing brochures. And suddenly all that polished confidence would start sliding downhill. I rested my left hand lightly against my lap and focused on keeping it steady. because the longer the evening continued, the more I realized something. Howard wasn't the only one performing. My body was performing too, every successful movement, every stable grip, every controlled gesture. A negotiation between damaged nerves and stubborn discipline, and eventually, one of them was going to lose. I loosened my grip beneath the table and rolled my wrist once. A habit, not a solution. The main course arrived in a coordinated parade of white jackets and polished trays. Plates appeared almost simultaneously around the table. Somebody in the kitchen had clearly spent 15 minutes arranging vegetables that would disappear in 15 seconds. The Oak Ridge Heritage Club loved details. My father loved places that loved details. The waiter set my plate down carefully. Filet mignon, roasted asparagus, fingerling potatoes. A sauce with a French name nobody at the table could actually pronounce. Howard immediately resumed discussing shipping infrastructure as if he personally invented cargo containers. Admiral Cole listened, asked occasional questions, took small bites. Meanwhile, Sutton spent more time arranging her utensils than using them. I sometimes wondered whether she enjoyed food or merely tolerated its existence. The conversation drifted toward federal port modernization projects. My father was in his element. Numbers, forecasts, expansion plans, profit margins. He quoted figures from memory. Terminal capacity increases of 18.7%. Projected throughput improvements. Infrastructure, investments. The performance was polished, maybe too polished. The Admiral remained pleasant. But the more he listened, the more I noticed something. He never seemed impressed. Interested, yes. Impressed, no, there is a difference. I focused on my own plate, slow movements, controlled movements, nothing dramatic. Most people assumed tremors meant constant shaking. It doesn't work that way. Some moments are perfectly normal, then a nerve misfires. Then another, then your hand suddenly decides it has different plans, like a rebellious employee, one that can't be fired, so I adapted. Right hand whenever possible, left hand only when necessary, small motions, no rushing. 8 years of military service teaches you something useful. Panic makes everything worse. A waiter topped off my water glass. The goblet was thick crystal, probably weighing more than necessary because expensive places enjoy turning ordinary objects into furniture. I took another bite, listened, waited. The tremor stayed quiet. For now, across the table, Sutton was smiling at something Admiral Cole had said. Not because it was funny, because important people were present. My sister's smile had categories. I knew most of them. Then my father mentioned a recent charity fundraiser. Naturally. Every businessman eventually arrives at philanthropy during negotiations, the wealthy version of showing your report card. We raised nearly $400,000 for veterans' housing initiatives last year. The Admiral nodded. That's good. Howard smiled. A little wider. The problem with chasing approval is that you can never stop chasing it. I cut another piece of steak, carefully. No issues, no tremor, no drama, everything remained stable. Then I reached for the water. The glass sat slightly farther away than I expected. Not much, just enough. My right hand touched it first. Normally that would have been fine. Tonight the goblet was nearly full, heavy, awkward. Instinctively, my left hand moved to assist. My brain sent the signal, my arm received it. Somewhere in between, things went wrong. A sudden spasm shot through my wrist, sharp, fast, violent enough to surprise me. My fingers tightened, then released. The crystal goblet shifted. For a split second, gravity took over. Years of training reacted before conscious thought. I caught the glass, barely. Water sloshed against the rim. A few drops escaped. The disaster should have ended there. Instead, my knuckles slammed into the edge of my porcelain plate. The impact wasn't huge, but it was enough. The heavy silver dinner knife jumped, spun once, then launched itself directly onto the hardwood floor, clang. The sound cracked through the dining room, sharp, metallic, impossible to ignore. Conversations stopped. Not all of them. Enough. Several nearby heads turned. A couple at the next table looked over. A waiter changed direction immediately. The piano player didn't miss a note. Professional. My stomach sank, not because of the knife, because of the reactions. The waiter arrived beside me. No problem, ma'am. He bent down, retrieved the knife. Professional, kind, normal. Exactly how most people would handle a dropped utensil. I nodded. Sorry about that. It happens. Because it does. Every day. Thousands of times. Restaurants survive. Civilization continues. Nobody dies. Unfortunately, Howard Gallagher did not live in the same reality as the rest of civilization. I didn't need to look at him. I could feel it, the tension, the calculation, the embarrassment. Across from me, my mother froze completely, one hand resting against her water glass, eyes lowered, silent. Beside me, Sutton closed her eyes, then pinched the bridge of her nose. The gesture lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough. Nothing says family support quite like reacting to a dropped knife as if someone crashed a vehicle through the wall. I kept my gaze on the table. The tremor hadn't stopped. My left hand rested against the white tablecloth. Visible now, the muscles continued twitching. Small movements. Unwanted movements, honest movements. The waiter returned with a replacement knife. Here you go. Thank you. Another nod. Another moment of basic human decency. Then he walked away. The surrounding tables gradually returned to their conversations. The interruption had lasted less than 30 seconds. Most people were already forgetting it happened. I wished my father belonged to that category. The silence at our table felt different, heavier. Not because anything serious had occurred, because image had been damaged, and image was sacred. I could almost hear Howard's internal calculations. Federal contract, VIP guest, perfect evening, imperfect daughter. The equation wasn't difficult. For years, my father had measured success through appearances. The right suit, the right table, the right connections, the right family photograph. Everything carefully arranged, everything controlled. Then reality showed up, carrying a trembling hand. I picked up the replacement knife, steadier now. The worst of the spasm had passed. Across the table, Admiral Cole quietly set down his fork. He hadn't spoken during the incident, hadn't rushed to rescue me, hadn't offered pity. Oddly enough, I appreciated that. Pity is usually just another form of attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted. For a moment, the Admiral's eyes moved toward my hand, not judging, not curious, observing. The way experienced people observe things. Then his gaze shifted toward my father, just briefly. Something unreadable passed across his expression, then it disappeared. The conversation had stopped, the performance had cracked, and I had a feeling my father was about to make a very expensive mistake. My father cleared his throat. That sound alone made me look up. Not because it was loud, because I knew it. Howard Gallagher only cleared his throat when he was about to take control of a room. The waiter had barely stepped away with the dropped knife before my father's decided the situation needed management. Not compassion, management. There was still a faint tremor moving through my left hand. I kept it resting against the tablecloth. Tried not to draw attention to it. Tried not to think about the dozen eyes that had briefly turned toward our table. Most people had already moved on. Unfortunately, my father wasn't most people. He forced a laugh, a little too loud, a little too sudden, the kind of laugh that arrives before the joke. Several nearby conversations paused again. Howard smiled at Admiral Cole. "Forgive my daughter, Admiral." The smile stayed in place. The warmth did not. She went off to play soldier and came back too jittery to hold a piece of silverware. A few seconds passed. Nobody laughed, not even Sutton, not immediately. The joke landed with all the grace of a toolbox falling down a staircase. I felt my body go completely still. Not angry, not shocked, still. Years in the military teach you something useful about bad situations. The first reaction isn't always movement. Sometimes it's observation. So I observed. My father's smile, the Admiral's face, my mother's hands tightening around her napkin. The silence. Especially the silence. Howard mistook it for encouragement. That would prove costly. He leaned slightly toward Admiral Cole, the way businessmen do when they think they're sharing insider wisdom, the way people act when they're absolutely certain they understand the room. She claims it's an injury. Claims. Interesting word. Surgeries, physical therapy, VA evaluations, neurological assessments, thousands of documented pages, apparently all downgraded to a claim, Howard continued. But, frankly, I think she uses it as a pathetic excuse for losing her refinement. There it was, the real speech, not the joke, not the smile, the truth hiding underneath both. My father had never forgiven me for returning different than I left. Not because I embarrassed him, because I complicated his narrative. A daughter with military medals looked impressive. A daughter with visible consequences made people ask questions. Questions require honesty. Honesty has never been my father's favorite hobby. Sutton finally smirked. Just a little. Enough to confirm she'd heard versions of this speech before. Probably many times. Howard wasn't finished. Of course he wasn't. People who enjoy hearing themselves rarely stop voluntarily. She's been a walking disaster since she got back. Walking disaster. I rolled the phrase around in my head, almost admired it. Such efficient cruelty. 7 rescue commendations. Walking disaster. A Navy Achievement Medal. Walking disaster. Pulling a wounded pilot out of a burning aircraft. Walking disaster. Amazing how language works. The right words can shrink a life into a punchline. Across the table, my mother stared at her plate. Not the Admiral, not me, not Howard, the plate. I knew that look. Cynthia had perfected it over decades. The expression of someone hoping silence might prevent a collision. The problem is that silence rarely prevents anything. It usually just reserves a front row seat. My father waited, smiling, confident, expecting partnership, expecting agreement, expecting another man to join him in treating his daughter like a minor inconvenience. The strange thing was that I wasn't embarrassed anymore. That feeling had passed. Embarrassment requires believing you've done something wrong. I dropped a knife, that's all. Human beings drop things, children drop things, surgeons drop things, professional athletes drop things, Congress drops entire budgets. Life continues. The embarrassing part wasn't the knife. It was watching a grown man sacrifice his daughter to protect his own ego. That part was harder to ignore. The dining room suddenly felt quieter than before. Not literally. People were still talking. Glasses still moved. Silverware still touched plates. But my attention had narrowed. Military training does that too. Stress compresses the world. You stop hearing everything. You hear what matters. And right now what mattered was Admiral Cole. Because Howard had just made a dangerous assumption. He assumed every powerful man measured value the way he did. Status, presentation, convenience. The Admiral had been mostly silent throughout dinner. That silence suddenly felt important. I glanced toward him. His expression hadn't changed. Not noticeably. No anger, no amusement, no visible reaction. Just attention. Focused attention. The kind that makes you wonder whether you're being evaluated. My father mistook that silence too, naturally. If you ask me, Howard continued, chuckling lightly, the military teaches people plenty of useful skills. Another smile, another attempt, but elegance isn't one of them. This time, Sutton actually laughed. A quick breath through her nose. Tiny, almost invisible. Still there, my mother closed her eyes for half a second, then reopened them. Nobody else joined in, not a single person. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was worse. Natural silence is harmless. Forced silence has weight. My father finally seemed to notice something wasn't working. His smile weakened slightly, just slightly, like a crack forming in fresh paint. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared. Tiny, brief, but real. I looked down at my left hand. The tremor had settled into small movements again. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just damaged nerves doing what damaged nerves do. The burn scars disappeared beneath the silk cuff my mother had chosen. The same cuff designed to make everyone more comfortable. The same cuff designed to hide evidence. And sitting there, listening to my father reduce years of service to a joke, I suddenly understood something with complete clarity. Howard wasn't ashamed of my injury. He was ashamed that it could be seen. Those are very different things. One is concern, the other is vanity. The distinction matters. Because once you understand the difference, you stop expecting kindness from the wrong people. Across the table, Admiral Cole slowly placed his fork beside his plate. The movement was calm, measured, unhurried, but something about it caused my father's smile to disappear completely. And for the first time that evening, Howard Gallagher looked nervous. I watched my father's confidence begin to wobble. Not collapse, not yet, just wobble. The way a chair feels when one leg is slightly shorter than the others. For the first time that evening, Howard looked uncertain about the room, and uncertainty looked strange on him. Most people would have reacted. A sharp reply, an argument, a dramatic exit. If this were one of those movies Sutton liked to watch on private flights, I probably would have stood up, thrown a glass of wine across the table, and delivered a speech powerful enough to earn its own soundtrack. Real life is usually less theatrical, and far more revealing. I stayed seated. The silence remained exactly where it was. Across the room, somebody laughed at another table. A server carried a tray of desserts toward the banquet section. The piano continued near the bar. The world hadn't stopped because my father embarrassed me. That realization felt oddly comforting. Sometimes the most painful moments of your life are barely noticed by anyone else. The world keeps moving. I looked down at my left hand. The tremor had settled into a slow rhythm again. Small movements, tiny corrections. the familiar negotiation between damaged nerves and stubborn muscle memory. I had spent years trying to control it, years learning which motions triggered it, years rebuilding strength, years sitting in rehabilitation rooms beside people carrying injuries much worse than mine. Nobody there complained about elegance. Nobody there cared whether a dinner guest dropped a knife. The memory made me almost smile. Almost. My eyes drifted toward the silk cuff covering my forearm, my mother's idea, not mine. I remembered standing in her kitchen 3 nights earlier while she held the blouse against me. "It's beautiful," she'd said. I knew what she meant. Not beautiful. Useful long sleeves. Soft fabric. Less visible evidence. A solution for photographs, not a solution for reality. Across the table, my mother still couldn't look directly at me. That hurt more than I expected. Not because she agreed with Howard. Because she didn't. That was the problem. People often think betrayal requires action. Sometimes all it requires is silence. The room remained still, waiting. My father didn't speak. The Admiral didn't speak. Even Sutton seemed unsure whether she should continue smiling. I looked at Howard. Really looked at him. The expensive suit, the carefully maintained hair, the gold watch, the polished image. A man who built a shipping empire from determination, intelligence, and relentless ambition. Those things were real. I would never deny that. But somewhere along the way, success had become his entire personality. Everything was measured by presentation, everything. Business relationships, social standing, children, especially children. I suddenly remembered a fundraiser from 6 years earlier, a charity gala downtown. I had attended in uniform before one of my deployments. Howard spent half the evening introducing me to donors. He loved the uniform, loved the photographs, loved the compliments. Back then I thought he was proud of me. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe he was proud of the image. Images are easier than people. Images don't disappoint you. Images don't come home with scars. A strange calm settled over me. Not forgiveness, not sadness, something colder, clearer, the feeling you get when a complicated math problem finally makes sense. For years I'd been trying to earn something from my father. Approval, respect, recognition, any of it. A phone call after deployments, a sincere question, a conversation that wasn't about appearances. Something, anything. And sitting there at that table, I finally understood the mistake. I was asking the wrong person. You can't negotiate warmth from someone who values usefulness above humanity. You can't explain dignity to someone obsessed with presentation. And you can't force respect out of a man who only understands status. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. That's why it mattered. I stopped waiting. The pressure disappeared immediately. Not gradually. Immediately. Like setting down a heavy box you forgot you were carrying. My left hand twitched again. I looked at it, then at the silk cuff, then at my mother. For a second our eyes met. She knew exactly what I was about to do. Her expression changed. Not much. A silent plea. Please don't. Please keep the peace. Please keep hiding. I understood. I just couldn't do it anymore. Slowly, I reached for the cuff. No sudden movements, no performance, no anger. I folded the silk back, an inch, then another, then another. The room didn't gasp, nobody dropped a fork, nobody pointed, because real life isn't theater. The burn grafts emerged gradually beneath the dining room lighting, pale, jagged, uneven. The skin climbing from my wrist toward my elbow carried the unmistakable texture left behind by severe burns and reconstructive surgery. Nothing elegant about it, nothing decorative. Nothing easy to explain away, just evidence. I rolled the second cuff back as well, not because that arm carried scars, because I was done hiding one hand and pretending the other explained it. Then I placed both hands flat on the table. The movement felt surprisingly ordinary, almost boring, and yet somehow it changed everything. The tremor remained visible, the scars remained visible, the truth remained visible. I didn't say a word. There was nothing worth saying. Defending myself would imply a debate existed. There wasn't one. My father had offered an opinion. My skin offered documentation. The difference mattered. Across the table, Sutton's expression disappeared completely. For once she had no prepared reaction, no comment, no correction, nothing. My mother lowered her eyes. The Admiral looked directly at my forearm, not quickly, not awkwardly, the way professionals examine facts, the way experienced people recognize something familiar. And in that moment, I noticed something I hadn't seen all evening. For the first time since arriving, Admiral Thaddeus Cole wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my father. And the disappointment in his eyes was far more dangerous than anger could ever be. The disappointment in Admiral Cole's eyes stayed exactly where it was. He didn't rush to fill the silence. That made it worse. People often think power announces itself loudly. In my experience, real authority usually does the opposite. It waits, it watches. It allows other people enough rope to explain who they are. The Admiral looked at my arm. Then he looked at my father, then at my arm again. Nobody moved. The dining room continued around us. Glasses clinked, servers crossed the floor, conversations drifted from nearby tables. Somewhere behind me, somebody laughed at a joke that had absolutely nothing to do with our table. Life kept moving. Our corner of the room did not. Howard finally attempted a smile. It appeared briefly, then disappeared. Like a software glitch. "I may have worded that poorly," he said. Nobody answered. The Admiral's gaze shifted downward, slowly, deliberately, toward my father's hands. Soft hands, perfect hands. The hands of a man who had built an empire through intelligence, contracts, negotiations, and risk calculations. There was nothing wrong with that. Success wasn't the issue. Character was. The Admiral's eyes moved next toward Sutton's manicured fingers resting beside her wine glass, then toward my forearm, toward the thick burn grafts exposed beneath the dining room lights, toward the uneven texture of skin rebuilt by surgeons, toward evidence, not opinions. Evidence. Something changed in his expression. Not shock, recognition. I had seen that look before. Military hospitals, VA facilities, rehabilitation centers, veterans events. The look people get when they recognize the cost of something because they've paid a version of it themselves. Admiral Thaddeus Cole knew exactly what he was looking at. Not the medical specifics, the story behind it, the kind of burn patterns that don't happen in office buildings, the kind that don't happen during training exercises, the kind that happen when something goes very wrong and somebody chooses to stay anyway. My father swallowed. Hard. The sound was surprisingly loud. The Admiral reached down, picked up his knife, turned it once in his fingers, then placed it carefully beside his plate. The small metallic click against the china seemed louder than the knife I'd dropped earlier, because this time everybody at the table understood something important was about to happen. My mother's posture stiffened. Sutton stopped looking confident. Even the air felt different. The Admiral folded his hands together. No anger, no performance, no dramatic build-up. Just certainty, Mr. Gallagher. His voice wasn't loud. That was the frightening part. The quieter he spoke, the more attention people paid. Howard immediately straightened. "Admiral, I." The Admiral continued before he could finish. "A man who looks at the scars his daughter earned pulling Americans out of the fire." He paused, just long enough, and calls it a lack of refinement. Another pause. Nobody breathed. "Lacks the basic character required to do business with my fleet." Silence. Complete silence. For one beautiful second, the entire evening stopped pretending. My father's face emptied. The color drained so quickly it looked painful. His mouth opened, closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. I had never seen Howard Gallagher speechless. Not once. Not during board meetings. Not during family arguments. Not during a federal tax audit that nearly gave 3 executives ulcers. The man always had words. Tonight they abandoned him. Sutton stared at the Admiral, then at my father, then back at the Admiral. Her expression looked almost confused, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why the script had changed. The script wasn't supposed to change. Important men were supposed to admire Howard. Successful men were supposed to agree with him. Powerful people were supposed to see what he saw. Instead, one powerful man had seen exactly the opposite. The realization landed hard. My mother lowered her eyes again, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It looked more like shame, not for me, for him. Howard finally found his voice. "Admiral, surely that's not what I meant." Cole looked at him, nothing else. Just looked. I have seen instructors silence an entire room with less effort than that. The Admiral didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't debate, because there was nothing left to debate. My father had already testified against himself. All Cole had done was listen. "Intent matters," Howard continued. The desperation was becoming visible now. The comment was misunderstood. The Admiral remained perfectly still. "No, Mr. Gallagher." Another pause. I understood it very clearly. That sentence hit harder than anything else, because it removed every escape route. No misunderstanding, no confusion, no miscommunication, just accountability. A concept my father usually preferred to assign to other people. For the first time all evening, I almost felt sorry for him, almost. Then I remembered the joke, the smirk, the years, the constant request to hide the scars, hide the hand, hide the evidence, hide the reality. Eventually, sympathy ran out of fuel. Howard glanced toward me. Not because he cared what I thought, because he wanted help. That was the truly remarkable part. The same daughter he'd spent years minimizing had suddenly become important again. I offered nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not rescue, just silence. The same silence he'd given me countless times. Funny how valuable silence becomes when it finally changes direction. The Admiral pushed his chair back. The movement was calm, controlled, final. Every instinct at the table understood what it meant. My father's contract wasn't dead because of business. It wasn't dead because of numbers. It wasn't dead because of logistics. It was dying because character had entered the conversation. And character is difficult to fake once somebody qualified starts looking closely. The chair beside Howard suddenly looked enormous. An empty space, waiting for consequences to sit down. And as Admiral Cole rose from the table, nobody, not even Howard Gallagher himself, could pretend anymore that this evening was still salvageable. The chair legs settled softly against the hardwood floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a few seconds, the entire table seemed trapped inside the consequences of a conversation that had finally become honest. Admiral Cole stood calmly beside his place setting. Not triumphant, not angry, just finished. My father remained frozen in his chair. I've seen people lose money before. I've seen investors lose fortunes. I've seen business owners lose contracts. The look on Howard's face wasn't about money, it was worse. He had spent his entire life believing reputation could control reality. Tonight reality had refused. The Admiral reached for his crystal water glass, then his napkin. Simple movements, ordinary movements. Yet somehow they carried more authority than all the speeches my father had delivered throughout the evening. Howard tried one last time. Admiral, if you'll just give me a moment to explain. Cole didn't interrupt him. He simply looked down. The way an experienced captain might look at a chart that had already been proven wrong. The sentence died halfway out of my father's mouth. That was the final lesson. Some doors don't slam, they quietly stop opening. The Admiral's attention shifted away from Howard completely, not dramatically, not cruelly, just permanently. And that seemed to hurt more than any argument ever could. Because being dismissed is different from being defeated. Defeat implies the fight mattered. Dismissal means it never did. Then he turned toward me. For the first time all evening, the tension left his face. Not entirely, just enough. He offered a small nod. Precise, respectful, military. The kind of gesture that says more than an entire conversation. Maeve. His voice was calm. There was no audience in it, no performance, no pity, just respect. There is a quieter table near the windows. I followed his gaze. A small table sat along the far side of the dining room overlooking the harbor lights beyond the glass. Away from the crowd, away from the performance, away from everything this evening had become. The Admiral looked back at me. If you'll allow me, I'd be honored to share a meal with someone who actually understands the weight of this country. Nobody at the table breathed. At least, it felt that way. The invitation wasn't really about dinner. Everyone understood that, including my father, especially my father. For months, he'd worked toward this contract. Endless meetings, presentations, consultants, travel schedules, private briefings. He had probably spent more than $18,000 on events designed to impress the right people. And now the one person whose opinion mattered had chosen to leave with the daughter he spent the evening diminishing. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. I looked at Howard, not because I wanted revenge, because for the first time in my life, I genuinely didn't need anything from him. No apology, no approval, no recognition. Nothing. The freedom of that realization surprised me. My father stared at the table. His expensive watch, his untouched water glass, his abandoned script, everything he'd carefully built for the evening was still physically present, only now it was useless. People spend years chasing status, very few spend time building character. Eventually, the difference becomes visible. I looked at my mother. She finally met my eyes. There were 1,000 things neither of us said: regret, love, frustration, history. None of them required words. Then I looked at Sutton. For once, she wasn't checking her reflection. She wasn't adjusting her posture. She wasn't managing appearances. She looked confused, almost lost. As if she'd just discovered the world operated by rules she didn't understand. Maybe she had. I stood, slowly. My left hand remained visible, the scars remained visible, the tremor remained visible. None of it mattered anymore. "I'd like that very much, sir," the Admiral nodded, and together we walked away. No dramatic music, no applause, no confrontation. Just two people crossing a dining room. Sometimes the quietest exits leave the deepest marks. As we moved through the club, conversations continued around us. Servers carried trays. Guests ordered dessert. The pianist shifted into another song. The world remained wonderfully indifferent. That may be one of life's greatest gifts. The universe doesn't pause to evaluate your worst moments. It keeps moving. The small table near the windows sat overlooking the harbor. Beyond the glass, cargo cranes stood against the night sky. Navigation lights blinked across dark water. A tugboat moved slowly through the channel, guiding a container vessel toward open sea. The Admiral settled into his chair. "So," he said. I smiled. "So." For the next hour, we barely discussed the contract, or my father, or the disaster at the table. Instead, we talked about ships, rescue operations, storms, crew members, bad coffee aboard military vessels, the strange humor people develop when they've spent enough time near danger. At one point, he mentioned a chief petty officer who once set off a fire suppression system trying to heat soup with equipment clearly not designed for soup. I laughed harder than I had all year. The Admiral laughed too. Not because the story was extraordinary, because it was true. Truth usually ages better than performance. Eventually, our plates disappeared. The dining room grew quieter. The harbor lights reflected against the windows. My left hand rested on the table, visible. Unhidden, the tremor still there, the scars still there. The Admiral glanced at it once, then looked back at me. No discomfort, no curiosity, no pity, just understanding. People often think dignity comes from perfection. Perfect clothes, perfect manners, perfect appearances. My father believed that. A lot of people do. They're wrong. Dignity isn't found in flawless silverware. It isn't found in expensive rooms, and it certainly isn't found in pretending scars don't exist. Real dignity is simpler. It's telling the truth when hiding would be easier. It's standing your ground without becoming cruel. It's refusing to be ashamed of the price you paid for doing the right thing. The tremor moved through my fingers one last time. A small movement, barely noticeable. I wrapped my hand around my water glass and took a sip. Steady enough. That was enough. And sitting beside an old sailor who understood exactly what some things cost, I realized something my father never would. The strongest people aren't the ones whose hands never shake. They're the ones who keep holding the line anyway. I didn't think much about the contract after that night. Most people assume that's the part that mattered. The contract, the money, the public embarrassment, the look on my father's face when everything fell apart. I understand why people focus on that. It's the most visible part of the story. But honestly, it wasn't the thing that changed my life. The thing that changed my life happened much earlier. It happened at that table when I finally stopped needing something from my father. That sounds simple. It wasn't. For years, I kept trying, not in obvious ways. I wasn't calling him every week begging for praise. I wasn't asking for validation directly. What I did was much quieter, and probably more common. Every time I accomplished something, I hoped he would notice. Every promotion, every certification, every difficult milestone, every obstacle I managed to overcome after leaving the Navy. Part of me kept believing that eventually there would be a moment when he looked at me and saw what everyone else seemed to see. Someone who had worked hard, someone who had sacrificed, someone worth respecting. I kept thinking maybe the next achievement would do it. Maybe if I became more successful. Maybe if I earned more money. Maybe if I looked healthier. Maybe if my hand improved. Maybe if I became easier to explain at country clubs. Maybe then. The problem with that kind of thinking is that there is no finish line. Because the issue was never me. The issue was the person I was trying to convince. One of the hardest lessons I have ever learned is this. Some people cannot give you what you need. Not because you're unworthy. Not because you've failed. Not because you haven't tried hard enough. They simply don't have it to give. A person who measures human value through appearances will always struggle to appreciate sacrifice. A person obsessed with status will always miss character. A person who only sees what benefits them will eventually overlook everyone else, including their own family. I wish somebody had explained that to me when I was younger. It would have saved me years. Maybe you're listening right now and thinking about someone in your own life. A parent, a spouse, a sibling, a boss, a friend. Someone whose approval feels important. Someone who keeps moving the goalposts every time you get close. Someone who never quite acknowledges your effort. Someone who always finds the flaw. The mistake many of us make is believing that one more accomplishment will finally change their mind. We keep working, keep proving, keep explaining, keep exhausting ourselves. Meanwhile, the other person isn't changing at all. I saw this happen in the military too, not just with families. People would spend years trying to impress leaders who had already decided how they felt. Trying to earn loyalty from people who weren't capable of loyalty. Trying to receive respect from people who didn't respect anyone. You can't win those battles. Not because you're weak. Because they're not real battles. The outcome was decided before you arrived. One thing Admiral Cole taught me without ever directly saying it was this: respect and approval are not the same thing. Approval is conditional. Respect isn't. Approval says, I'll value you if you fit my expectations. Respect says, I recognize your value even when you don't. That distinction changed how I viewed almost every relationship in my life. After leaving the Navy, I spent a lot of time around people whose lives didn't go according to plan. Veterans, first responders, dock workers, nurses, single parents. People carrying burdens nobody else could see. One thing they all had in common was this: the strongest among them weren't chasing applause. They were building lives. There's a difference. One depends on other people. The other depends on you. The night at Oak Ridge forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I had allowed my father to remain a judge in a contest he was never qualified to evaluate. Imagine asking someone who hates music to review a symphony, or asking someone who has never been in the ocean to judge a rescue swimmer. It doesn't make sense. Yet many of us do exactly that with our lives. We hand authority to people who don't understand what we've survived. Then we feel devastated when they misjudge us. Looking back, I don't blame myself for wanting my father's respect. That's a normal human desire. Most sons and daughters want that. What changed was realizing I didn't need it anymore. There's freedom in that. Real freedom. The kind that doesn't come from money or success. The kind that comes from no longer handing someone else control over your worth. If you've spent years trying to convince somebody that you're enough, I want you to consider something. What if you're already enough? What if the problem isn't your effort? What if the problem is that you've been standing in front of the wrong audience? That realization doesn't solve everything overnight. It won't erase disappointment. It won't erase hurt. But it gives you somewhere solid to stand. And sometimes that's all you need. Not another victory, not another achievement, not another explanation. Just a place to stand where your value doesn't depend on someone else's permission. That's the lesson I carried away from that dinner. Not that my father lost something, but that I finally stopped losing myself trying to win something he was never prepared to give. A few weeks after that dinner, I stopped by a grocery store on my way home. Nothing important happened. At least that's what I thought at the time. I was standing in the checkout line when a little boy noticed my arm. Kids are different from adults. Adults stare when they think you're not looking. Kids just ask, "What happened to your arm?" His mother looked horrified. The poor woman immediately started apologizing. I smiled and told her it was fine. Then I looked at the kid and said the truth. I got hurt doing my job. He nodded. That was enough for him. No discomfort. No awkwardness. No need for a complicated explanation. Just acceptance. The funny thing is that children often understand something adults struggle with. They notice what's different. Adults decide what it means. For a long time, I thought my scars were the story. People noticed them. Questions followed. Conversations changed. Eyes drifted toward my arm. It felt like the scars entered the room before I did. Eventually, I realized something. The scars were never the story. They were evidence that a story already happened. That's different. A scar isn't the event, it's the receipt. The event came first. The choice came first. The sacrifice came first. The struggle came first. The scar simply stayed behind. When I was in the Navy, I knew people carrying all kinds of scars. One rescue swimmer permanently lost hearing in one ear after a training accident. Another spent the rest of his life walking with a limp. A pilot I knew never fully recovered after losing members of his crew during an operation. From the outside, some injuries were obvious. Others were invisible. The invisible ones often lasted longer. That's something I wish more people understood. Not every scar sits on the skin. Some people carry theirs in silence. The woman working 2 jobs while taking care of her children. The husband sitting in a hospital waiting room every evening after work. The person rebuilding life after bankruptcy. The caregiver helping a parent with Alzheimer's. The veteran learning how to sleep through the night again. The teenager trying to survive a difficult home. The man who got laid off at 52 and had to start over. The single mother pretending everything is fine because her kids need stability. Every one of those people is carrying something. Most of us never see it. That's why I've become very careful about judging others. Life has a way of humbling you when you think you know somebody's story. A few years after my injury, I attended a veterans event. There was a man sitting alone near the back of the room. He looked perfectly healthy, no visible injuries, no cane, no scars, no signs of trauma. Several people walked right past him all evening. Later I learned he had spent years recovering from severe PTSD. The hardest battle of his life wasn't visible to anyone in that room. That stayed with me, because it reminded me how limited our perspective usually is. We tend to evaluate people based on what we can immediately see. Appearance, success, confidence, physical ability, social skills. But those things rarely tell the whole story. Sometimes they barely tell any of it. One of the most valuable habits I've developed is asking a different question. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with this person?" I try to ask, "What might this person be carrying?" That small shift changes everything. It changes how you treat people. It changes how patient you become. It changes how quickly you judge. And honestly, it changes how you view yourself too. A lot of people spend years ashamed of the things they've survived: the divorce, the illness, the addiction, the mistake, the failure, the injury, the grief. They hide those experiences because they believe scars make them less valuable. I've come to believe the opposite. The people I trust most are rarely the people who have lived perfect lives. They're the people who went through difficult things and remained decent human beings afterward. That takes work. More work than most people realize. You don't learn compassion from comfort, you usually learn it from hardship. You learn patience when life forces you to wait. You learn resilience when quitting would be easier. You learn empathy when you've needed it yourself. That's why scars matter. Not because they're impressive. Not because they make someone special. But because they often reveal what a person had to overcome. The older I get, the less interested I am in perfect people. Perfect people usually haven't been tested. Give me the person who got knocked down and stood back up. Give me the person who kept showing up when life became difficult. Give me the person who learned something from pain instead of spreading it to others. Those are the people worth knowing. And if you're carrying scars of your own, visible or invisible, I hope you remember something. You do not owe anyone an apology for surviving. You do not need to hide the evidence of battles that helped shape you. And you certainly do not need permission to value yourself, because the strongest parts of you may have been built in moments nobody else ever saw. The world tends to celebrate victories, but character is usually built during recovery, and recovery rarely looks impressive while it's happening. One of the last things Admiral Cole said to me that evening wasn't dramatic. There was no grand of speech, no life-changing quote carved into a plaque somewhere. In fact, it was so simple that I almost missed it. We were still sitting by the window overlooking the harbor. Most of the dinner crowd had gone home. The piano had stopped. The staff was quietly resetting tables for the next day. Outside, lights moved across the water. Inside, the room felt peaceful for the first time all night. At one point, we were talking about leadership. Not military leadership, just leadership in general. The kind people demonstrate every day. Managers, parents, teachers, business owners, neighbors, ordinary people. The Admiral took a sip of coffee and said something I've never forgotten. There are a lot of ranks in the world. Then he shrugged. But only one that really matters. That was it. No explanation, no speech, just a sentence. At the time, I didn't ask him what he meant. I already knew, because I'd spent the entire evening watching the answer unfold. My father had money, influence, connections, a successful company, a beautiful home, a respected name. On paper, he outranked almost everyone in that dining room. And yet, by the end of the night, none of those things mattered. Not because success is bad. Success isn't bad. Money isn't bad. Achievement isn't bad. I've known plenty of successful people who were also kind, generous, and honorable. The problem begins when success becomes your identity, when it becomes the only thing you measure. When you start evaluating human beings the same way you evaluate investments, return on investment, usefulness, appearance, performance. At that point, people stop being people. They become assets or liabilities, and that's a dangerous way to live. The older I get, the less impressed I am by titles. I've met people with impressive titles who treated everyone around them terribly. I've also met janitors, mechanics, nurses, teachers, and dock workers whose character was so strong that people naturally trusted them. Nobody had to announce their importance. You could feel it. Character has a way of revealing itself over time. Eventually, everyone shows you who they are, not through speeches, not through social media, not through carefully crafted public images, through choices, small choices, repeated choices. How they treat waiters, how they treat family members, how they treat people who can't do anything for them, how they behave when nobody is watching. Those moments tell the truth. I think that's why that dinner stayed with me. The contract wasn't the lesson. The embarrassment wasn't the lesson. Even the confrontation wasn't the lesson. The lesson was exposure. Everyone revealed themselves. My father revealed what he valued. My mother revealed the cost of silence. My sister revealed the danger of living for appearances. Admiral Cole revealed what genuine respect looks like. And I learned something about myself too. I learned that dignity isn't something another person gives you. It's something you practice every day. Sometimes dignity looks impressive. Most of the time it doesn't. Sometimes it's standing up for yourself. Sometimes it's walking away. Sometimes it's refusing to become bitter. That last one can be surprisingly difficult. For a while after that dinner, people asked whether I hated my father. The answer was no. Hate requires more energy than I was willing to spend. Besides, carrying resentment is a little like carrying an anchor. You can do it, but eventually you realize you're the one doing all the lifting. That doesn't mean you excuse bad behavior. It doesn't mean you ignore it. And it certainly doesn't mean you allow it to continue. It simply means you stop allowing it to control your future. One of the healthiest decisions I ever made was learning the difference between forgiveness and access. You can forgive someone. That doesn't automatically earn them a front row seat in your life. You can wish someone well. That doesn't mean they get unlimited influence over your happiness. Many people struggle with that distinction. I certainly did. But learning it changed everything. If you've listened to this entire story, I hope you take one thing with you. Choose people who value character more than appearance. Choose people who respect effort more than perfection. Choose people who care about who you are, not just how you make them look. And just as importantly, try to become that person for others. Because every day, someone around you is carrying a burden you know nothing about. Every day, someone is fighting a battle that doesn't show up in photographs. Every day, someone is wondering whether they're enough. You may never know what a little kindness means to them. The world has plenty of critics. It doesn't have enough people willing to understand. As for the scars on my arm, they're still there. The tremor is still there too. Some days are better than others. That's life. I've stopped wishing they would disappear. They remind me of the people we brought home. They remind me of what mattered. And they remind me that strength isn't the absence of damage. Strength is what remains after the damage. Thank you for spending this time with me and staying until the end of this story. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Every day we share stories about family, resilience, dignity, second chances, and the moments that reveal who people really are. New stories premiere daily, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself. And never let anyone convince you that the things you survived are something you should be ashamed of.